Okay, so let's go over the plug and play kits for Syvecs and how you get started with them. Obviously we now do lots of plug and play kits and each kit is a little bit different, but the importance of this video is to explain how when you get your kit, after you've plugged it in, how you get set up with the software side of things. Okay, so we've got our ECU, we're actually in a 2017 GTR here, so we've got our ECU, an S6 Plus plug and play kit. We've plugged it into the car, we've powered on the ignition, and we're now going to connect to the ECU for the first time. So we're going to open up SCAL, go to Device Connect, and we actually should find the device. Now at the moment it's on 1.571 firmware, which is found here, and basically the importance of this is to illustrate that this is generally the ECUs come blank. So when you actually connect to the ECU here now, you can see that the device has no calibration. So what we actually need to do is get the base map that the Syvecs support team have emailed you, so support@syvecs.com. They will send you a base map and tell them the spec of the car for whatever kit you've got, and we should have roughly a good base map to suit. So for this particular car, it's a 2017, it's got upgraded turbos and ID 1700 cc injectors, 5-bar map sensor. So I've got the calibration from them, I've chucked it on my desktop. And what I'm going to do now is actually upgrade the firmware to suit. So basically if we go to the calibration which has been sent, so go to desktop, look at this calibration which has been sent, and actually you can see it's a 1.83 firmware. So actually what I'm going to do first is either make a choice here of saying, do we keep this firmware or do we actually go for a later version? And what I'm actually going to do here is go for a later version and talk through some of the things that change. So go onto the Syvecs website, so www.syvecs forum. When you're on the website and here, you can go to S6 or the S8, latest firmware, and grab the latest firmware which you've got. So scroll to the bottom, and here you can see the latest firmware is 1.84. So if the firmware which the base map has been sent to you is available, use it, okay? But as you can see, 1.83 is not available. So the point I'm going to make here is actually now how to bring that calibration level up to the latest version of firmware. So I've actually got 1.88 because this is a version which they've been testing internally, and it's good to show it obviously as well on the car. So what we're going to do, we're going to run that firmware. So basically double click on the firmware. It will open up an EXE and ask you to enter the serial number of the ECU. This can be found here, 1729. So we're going to pop that in here, 1729. Press enter, and the ECU will actually begin to now be flashed and overwritten with the latest firmware. So it's going to take a little moment. Okay, and when it's finished, press spacebar. Now what we're going to do is go to that calibration which was sent. So desktop, open this calibration, the 1.83 version. So it's a base map for 1700cc injectors, stock car, 5-bar map sensor. Now what you need to do to change it to the latest version of software, if you go to Cal at the top and then change software version, then select S6, and I've just loaded the firmware version 1.88, so I'm going to select that. And what it will do now is it'll show you the following maps which imported successfully and the following maps which is not imported successfully. These are due to just changes or new maps, for example. So a good thing to do here is hit the tag button. So if we hit tag, this will actually illustrate all the new maps and new changes, etc. So after we've done that, what we need to do is look at some of the variables which could affect it from coming online. So generally these would be under IO configurations and pin assignments. Anything that's undefined in red, we need to set that to not connected or assign it. And also in the data streams, have a look to see, make sure there's no values in here that are set to not set. If there are, then set them to spare. Okay. So we've got that updated to 1.88. We're now going to file, save that now, change the firmware number at the front here. Doesn't make any difference at all, but I'm just changing it for revision checking on my end. Press OK. And now what we can do is go File, Close, and then go Device Connect again. So we're connected, and now what I'm going to do is load that calibration. So it's on the desktop, 1.88, GTR, and now we can see it's now loaded in, and the ECU has come online. If the ECU doesn't come online and says not connected in the top right, have a look down here in the bottom right to basically it will illustrate and write what the actual problem is. Have a look down here to make sure you know what's going on. And then at the top here, obviously all the new items in the firmware which are new are in the yellow. Have a look at those to make sure that you understand fully what they are. Okay. So, next stage. Let's get the configuration loaded for the logging. The logging config is set using the sconfig program. So we can find that by just typing in sconfig. Now basically what this means is you can actually go device and get the existing config, which is a default one which will come with part of the base map, which has some of the items logged already for you, which you can see. Go to sensors and you can see some of the items which are logged, like knock, etc. 120. The base configuration is decent for what you're looking to get used and set up with. You can also ask one of our support team to send a logging config for the particular kit. It does help sometimes because there are custom sensors which are assigned, and it's useful then for grabbing that data to put it in there. So if we're going to do that for this one, if we go to file load and grab, say, a 1.88, this one here. If the firmware software version at the top here doesn't match the firmware you've got, again you can go to config, change software version, S6 here, and then select the version of firmware which you've got. After you've done that, you can then just go device, set config, and it flashes that configuration which you've got being sent to you by the support team, which is one here for the GTR, straight into the ECU, and then the variables are set. If you want to add additional variables to look at when you're calibrating, say you want to look at your split amounts for 2 or corrections for air charge temp, you want to speed them up at all, you can basically come into here, click on the variable, and then enter, like say 50, so it's 50 times a second. You can even go up to 1,000 times a second if you wish. But generally for the slow items like that, for fuel multipliers, for air temps and that, 1 is generally good enough. And obviously the faster you log items, the less logging time you have available. So once you've got that set, device, set config, it flashes the config into the ECU, and then that way we can get on with the calibrating and start looking at the data logging. So under the logging functions here, you can set the point in which the data logging starts. So at the moment it's 100 RPM. The throttle is more than 5% and the vehicle speed is above 0. And for stopping, it's less than 50 RPM and the throttle is not taken into account of it, and the vehicle speed again is 0. And you can actually open a gauge like I have down here to see when the logging is active. So let's get this kit and this car running for the first time. So we've basically got the calibration loaded in, and I'm going to go to the fuel map now, just to base fuel map 1, because this is the one that's being used at the moment. There's no flex fuel assigned at the moment, it's at 0. So basically, no flex fuel used, kind of the base map would be set, and then base injection time 1 is where you'll be looking at. So let's get the kit running, so press the brake and start the car. So it fires up, you can see the lambda. Now the fuel multiplier closed loop 1 and 2 are currently at 1. These are basically like the short-term fuel trim, so to speak, that some people would can talk about when they're adjusting like fueling on a car. So you can see here that now the lambdas have come to about 0.9, and the fuel multiplier closed loop lambda 1 correction is at 0.89. Now obviously if you want to then bring that value closer to 1, so the ECU closed loop is not having to work as hard, basically what you would do, highlight this area where you are here, and then you can go math multiply, and then type in the value which you've actually got in fuel multiplier, so 0.877, and it will basically pull that value down, and you'll see the value then becomes closer to 1 at the same lambda. Okay, I'm going to take that out just for the minute. So you can see it's hunting a little bit around here, it's just jumping between these points, so I'm going to just fatten it up a bit here in these areas where it's jumping between these two segments of the car. This car has got high lift cams, so we need to go over some of the areas now that basically affect the idle, etc. You can see the idle ignition timing is jumping up and down ever so slightly there, and that can be just with the larger injectors jumping between 2 points here. working that's been added extra on this car. So basically the car is not stock, so it's got a 5-bar map sensor, and we can see that the manifold pressure map 1 value is just slightly below 1000 millibar, which is atmospheric pressure generally. So make sure you've got the right linearization set for that. Generally you should be seeing around about 1000 millibar around whatever your barometric pressure is outside, and you can obviously check under sensors, defined, manifold pressure, linearization to make sure you have the correct sensor assigned. You can also then, if you want to, go to linearization, sensor database, load sensor, and select the different types. This one is an SSI 5-bar absolute sensor. Select that and it will pop in there. If you've got a 3-bar or say a Syvecs 4-bar or a 7-bar, you can again select that and it will automatically update it. Okay, so I'm going to put it back to 5-bar. And then after you've changed that, you need to program the ECU to make sure it's saved. So device, program, ECU program, come back online, and your manifold pressure should be reading correct. Now this car has actually got an additional fuel pressure sensor wired in, so under fuel pressure sensors, linearization, make sure again that you've got the right sensor in there. This has got a SSI 10-bar, again under linearizations at the top here. Sensor database, load sensor, you'll find that this has got a SSI 150 psi 1. Select that. Well, I've already chose that, so that's punched in there. And I've assigned it correctly under inputs, fuel pressure, and this one is obviously wired into slave ANO6 input, so I've assigned it into there, programmed it. It's then online, and any extra sensors you want to wire in, if you want to wire in say a crankcase pressure sensor, you can wire it in, assign it in here, select the input you want, program it again. This obviously hasn't got anything assigned to that input, so yeah, you'll find that the sensor won't work, etc. So we can unassign that. We don't need it. Okay, so we're back to the point now of looking at the torque control. So this particular car is got different injectors to what the stock car have. Most of our base maps for say the newer stuff, like the VAG stuff, the Golf R, the RS3 kit that we've worked on, they're direct injection, so the direct injectors don't generally change, so you shouldn't have to change this value. But for this particular car, the injectors have an effect on the torque calculation, which is sent to the transmission ECU, which in fact turns the helps the gearbox know how much clamping pressure, etc., shift points and whatnot. So basically on the torque estimation, the alternative torque estimation fuel flow estimate is set to on with most of the GTR maps. And what this means is under fuel consumption here, injector fuel consumption scaling, you need to put in here the scaling amount of what the injectors flow. So this particular car's got ID 1700, so if I was to put 1700 and then divide that by 60, let's get it into milliliters per second. Sorry, 1770 divided by 60 equals 28.3. Now you can see here at the moment it's set to 26. Generally that's because some of the injector manufacturers, although they say they flow 1700, it depends on the fuel pressure they're running. This is actually running a slightly higher fuel pressure than what a stock car would run. The stock one would run about 3.5. This particular car is going to be running on ethanol, so we've bumped the fuel pressure up a little bit. So in that case, your fuel consumption scaling, you might have to raise it. But a good starting point would be to work at what the calculation works out. So pop in there 28, and then from there, obviously, if you feel that the shifting is a little bit soft or needs to be a bit firmer, after you've done a gearbox relearn, then you can come in here and change this value live, which will have an effect on the way the car drives. And I'll show that a bit later in the video to show you exactly how that works. So let's put in there 28 for the minute, because that is what we've worked out to be the calculation. Now, base injection time 1 is a table which is used at the moment, because under calibration switches, injection, fueling, base fuel map select is all on 1. No flex fuel is assigned on the car. So under fuel consumption, composition, sorry, we've got it as not connected. So flex fuel is not used, and under the flex fuel tab here, you can see it's disabled. So basically the base injection fuel table 1 will be used on this particular car. Okay, so let's get the car up and running, and we've basically put in our fuel injection scaling amount for the size of the injectors. we've got our base map here. The base injection table 1 is the table we're using. So we start it up. So you can see our lambdas are working both for bank 1 and 2, and the fuel multiplier correction here value is the closed loop adjustment amount which is being applied. Obviously this is a base map, I've just chucked a file in here, so it's not going to be absolutely spot on to start off with. But this is the whole point of getting the kit up and running and showing how you go about doing that. So yeah, so basically you can see now it's running about a 0.90 lambda. That's the target currently. These are quite large injectors. Generally you find when you tend to lean the lambda target out in the idle area where the injection time is very small, that the idle can sometimes become unstable. So this one is running about 0.9, and you can see the closed loop correction is pulling out 0.9%. If it's between 0.9 and 1.1, that's like 10% either way, it's quite nice. But to help the strategy out, I'm just going to pull out here, take out 0.9, and that will bring the lambda and the fuel closed loop corrections a bit closer together. As you can see, they are now. So basically the next area to look at is obviously, then is generally what most calibrators have to do, is go over the tuning of the car. You can see our torque values down here at the bottom. Engine torque estimate output trans currently is around about 20 Newton meters. Generally speaking, on the GTR, on most cars, that you want that around about 0, because at the moment there is 0 torque on the engine. The car, the RPM is not accelerated; it's holding flat. So what we can do to help that is obviously different. The engine friction does change based on the internals of the engine, and also the thermal efficiency will change based on the camshafts which are used. So the thermal efficiency map is a nice map to be able to come in here and actually change it for the type of the engine setup. So I'm going to pull this back and get it to around about there. So you can see the engine torque estimate trans now is around about 0 to 1, around about there, which is where it needs to be. So then we're going to get back to the fuel map. Now you can see, obviously I can fly through this quite quickly. You can also, I use shortcuts. So if you go to cal and then shortcuts, you can see in here that I have set shortcuts which I used. So you can just go to on the top one and press set, and then select the map you want to use. So I just use the base injection table, press OK on here, and then when I press F3 it goes to my ignition map, F4, 5 limiter maps, maximum drive-by-wire maps, and back to the fuel map. So let's get this car up and running and start moving and look at how close we are on the fueling and where we need to be. So put the car into R mode, traction control off because we're on the dyno currently, and we can start to pull away. Go up through the gears, and you can see in the areas here where I lift off, actually in the low load areas, the fuel multiplier goes to 1. That's because the closed loop lambda control is turning off in that area. It's quite important to do that, because what can happen otherwise is basically if you were to lift off and the fuel multiplier is pulling out fuel in that area, as it comes back to idle it can become unstable. So on a dyno at the moment, I'm going to turn the fan on and get it cooling the car, etc. is important. So then what we can do is, obviously this is a brand new engine, so we're going to actually just run it in at the same time as actually calibrating the fueling and show you how easily that is done. So you can see here, if I go to corrections and then close loop lambda target 1, because this is the table we're using at the moment, because the flex fuel was not assigned. And when the flex fuel is assigned, what it will then do is it will go between base injection target 1 and 2 depending on the ethanol content. So an ethanol content of 100% would use base target 2, and when the fuel composition is at 0, it will use a target 1 table. So let's go back to my fuel map by pressing the F2 shortcut that I set. And what we can see here is the fuel multiplier correction values. Obviously this is the amount that it's pulling out. If we start to increase the load by increasing the throttle opening, you can see this is fairly close. And as the manifold pressure is coming up, the lambda target is obviously riching up, and in turn so is the mixture. But generally we can see that it's pulling out about in the region of 0.9. So what we can easily do, select this whole area up here, just a real quick grab, math multiply 0.9 instantly it will pull the fueling out. You'll see the corrections then get closer to 1, and you can even go as far as, obviously you can see the multiplier corrections are slightly different bank to bank. This can be down to very low throttle openings. The throttles might not be in the exact same location in terms of the scaling. You can go and scale them if you want. These are aftermarket throttles on here. But as you can see, as I start to open the throttle up more, the airflow is pretty equal between the two banks. So now we've got it running. Another thing that's important to look at is the variable valve timing. So as you can see in the bottom right down here, you can see that they're actually not both at 0. So one thing you need to do here, go to your variable valve timing area, cam angle measurements. So the actual latch offsets is what we need to adjust to get them to 0, because at the moment both the cams aren't driven. No duties being applied to them. If you go to gauge and then go to variable valve timing, which are part of the default layouts in the gauges, you can see that duty is not being applied to it. It's 0 here. And what we need to do is get these latch offset values closer to 0 in order for the strategy to work as best it can. So the VVT in raw values, you can see here, we've got 163 and 403. And it's quite simple, you just need to punch these into here. So 163 and 402. Sorry, this one here. 402, and you can then see the VVT values are a bit closer to 1, so it makes life a bit easier. You can obviously expand this, go to right click it and go size normal to have a bit of a closer eye on what those values are. The 1 is good. Okay, so once we've got that set, let's go back to this fuel table, gauge, back to my tuning template. And what the other thing is then look at is the idle base duty. So you can see up here TPS is currently around about 5.6%. Okay, now this is important to look at because basically if I was to rev the engine, as it comes back down to idle, the base duty, you want it to be looking at that kind of that base area where the actual car is idling for the throttle position. So if we go to then idle control and base duty 1, base duty 1 is the one which is used when the car is stationary. Okay, so you can see in here currently where we are, we've got engine runtime as the left axis and the coolant temperature on the right. So in here we've got 5.7. Okay, so it's important to have that close to what the actual duty is when the car is idling. Make sure that there is no aircon adder being applied. So if the aircon switch is on, which it is at the moment, just have a look at the aircon base duty which is being applied, so it's 0.34. So if you were to actually look at your drive-by-wire target idle here, you can see it's 5.6, which is close to what the actual TPS is currently. And if you were then to turn off the AC, you'll see the drive-by-wire target idle comes down because of the fact that the idle base duty adder is being taken out. We'll turn this back on. So what can happen if this is set wrong? So if we bring this down, if we actually subtract, we just pull this right down and take our base duty out, the closed loop will obviously kick in to bring in the integral, as you can see is being applied here, slowly coming up to bring the idle control back to maintaining the correct throttle opening. But what can happen is if the integral is adding loads here, when you rev the car and come out of idle control, the integral is going to go back to 0. So the key thing here is if you watch now when I rev it up, as it comes back down to idle, the idle drops below the target and then only starts to come back up when the integral is applied. So it's important, like I said, to have your base duty close to what the actual throttle position is needed when the actual car is idling and all the integrals, etc. have been applied to it to maintain it. And then if you've got under idle map select mode method, this is on cow switch, if you are to set it to gear, once you're not in neutral, then the base duty 2 table will be used. And you can use that if you've got like a quite an aggressive friction on the clutch, and when you put it into gear it pulls the RPM down a lot. You can actually do that. We'll actually do that now. So we'll set it to by gear and actually go to gauge add gear, trace. I'm going to copy this table here into the base duty 2. Same for the target. Copy that in there as well. So now when I put it into gear, you can see that actually the integral is already starting to add basically duty, and that's because, like I said, the friction is being applied on the clutch. It's slowly bringing the clutch in and added. So what we can do is come into the base duty, add 3, and then that way it basically stops the closed loop having to work so hard when it goes into gear. And then when you go back to neutral, it will drop the target down automatically, and it's a nice transition between neutral and drive. So let's look at some more of the fuel and ignition tuning. Most of the calibrators surely must know how to calibrate a fuel and ignition table. The purpose of me actually going over this video now is just basically show you how you go around the table and how you can change things to suit. If you again don't want to have it so your base injection table is set based on manifold sloping up, then you can go to your simple multiplier. You can set this based on how you'd want with, say, other ECUs where it's just a math multiplier that's being applied between the manifold pressure multipoints. So if I actually just turn this car off a sec, ignition back on, and then interpolate these 2 points. So if you want to have it so that basically you don't have your injection table based on manifold pressure and just literally only need to tune it then up to atmospheric. Obviously we've taken out a fair chunk of fuel here, so I'm going to probably have to add quite a bit to get the fueling back where it needs to be. But what we'll do now, from here 1000 millibar onwards, we can pretty much just copy this value now all the way to the top here, interpolate between these points, because above that now we know that where the pressure is going to change now, automatically the strategy using the simple manifold multiplier is going to automatically add the fueling. So we come back to here, see how far off it is. It's better be on the see, starts up, see how hard the closed loop is having to work. So we can see the idle is jumping around because it's quite lean here, so let's add 20%. Get the fueling roughly where it needs to be, so we need to add quite a lot of fuel because obviously we pulled out a lot. I'm obviously doing it. We could have easily calculated it by looking at the simple manifold pressure multiplier, looking at our manifold pressure one value and seeing how much it was pulling out. It should be in a region of about obviously 0.4, so obviously we needed to then apply 1.6 to it. But for the purpose of the video, I'm just easily hacking it around just to show you how well it's how easy you can jump between it. So let's interpolate this for the minute, because obviously what we're going to need, we're only going to really need to look at this 1000 millibar axis now. Let's just bring this table up. Okay, so like I said, so we've put into gear, manual mode. We're going to drive through the gears. You can see the engine torque estimation is changing. We can see it's a little bit lean here. So I'm on a mainline dyno, which allows me the luxury of being able to hold the load and RPM where I need to. So you can see here the closed loop again is having to add some fuel here. So we can very easily just highlight this whole row. I'm actually going to be quite harsh about this. If you want to have it so that the correction value is not so coarse, you can go to option and then go to fine or coarse. So at the moment I'm in fine. If you go to coarse, then obviously you can see the changes are a lot coarser. Option fine is obviously fine. So we're looking at that. So we've got our lambdas pretty close. The fuel multiplier values are pretty good, and then we can go up a bit. So now gone up. You can see here it's way too fat. So we're going to grab this whole area here, math multiply it by the correction amount which has been applied, 0.78. Instantly the lambda will come back to target. The multiplier will change back to close to 1. And then as we go up further, we've then got to pop some values in here, get the multiplier values close. And this is a new engine, so we're going to running in at the same time. Okay, so while we're there, the lambda values are pretty decent there. The fuel correction obviously is up to the end user. So you can see at the top here, device error has started flashing. That's a speed warning because the front wheels aren't moving. Okay, so it's a too slow, and that will then default the traction control to off. So basically, we then go up. We can then move on the main line. This really is a fantastic dyno. So again, we can see the V of the engine is obviously increased here. The variable valves are on. I'm going to pop some more fuel in there, get it close. Come down. Just interpolate between there because that's going to work nice. Oh, press the wrong button. Obviously, you can press undo to undo what you were doing, which is quite a nice tool. So if you Now I'm going to interpolate between here, math I, Y. And come down on the load. So you can see at this particular point here, need some more fuel. And what I'm aiming is just aiming to get the fuel multiplier lambda basically around as close to 1 as possible. Makes the ECU's life easier. Go up again on the RPM with the main line. That's pretty good in this area. It's come down a bit. Imagine it needs more fuel here, because you can see the shape of the engines. And you can see the closing lambda is actually turning off in the overrun areas here. Basically what you want actually to happen is in the manifold pressure when you lift off, you want the lambda control to turn off. It's a nice way of stopping the lambda control ramping up on the amount of fuel that's being taken out and causing the idle, coming back to idle, to be a bit rough. So when we lift off, let's have a look at the manifold pressure value. You can see it's going down to less than 200 millibar. So at 200 millibar, we don't want the lambda control on, but above that we do. So in here, you can actually see where it's set off here because it's 0. So I'm going to grab that in these values here. We can pop that on in there now. And then when it's in the overrun in 200, we've got it turned off. Because what can happen, I can actually just show you it happening. If I was to fill in here a value of 1, when I rev it up and it comes back down, you can see the lambda control will automatically start pulling it out. Now it's not doing it on this because the fuel cut is coming on, but if you weren't to have any overrun fuel cut set, because some people don't like that, then you would find that basically the fuel multiplier closed loop will actually be taken out. If there's any torque fuel set or torque ignition severity set, then the closed loop automatically turns off. So you can see here the overrun fuel cut turns off, and hence so does that. But some cars, it helps not to have the overrun fuel cut on. It can be quite aggressive when you lift off, and hence makes the transition between on and off throttle a bit harsh. Let's go back to this fuel map. The purpose of this video is not to show you how to calibrate a car, but I just wanted to roughly check the fueling's in the right area. So you can see it's adding a massive amount here. So we're going to grab this area here, select the whole way up, just to make it easier. And then if we bring the RPM down into this area here, you can see the ECU's heading to add there. So a nice way to do it is just interpolate between that MIX. This is where the engine's volume efficiency changes. So we've got our fuel multiplier values pretty close to 1 there. That's a good start. When you're doing this at high thing, just keep an eye on the water temperature. Obviously, you can't replicate the airflow from the road, so it's important to make sure, unless your fan is adequate, keep an eye on the water temperature to make sure it's not pulling out too much. So let's tidy up this fueling around here. You can see it's pulling out about 0.9 here. And that's a good starting point for our fueling. So another area then to look at for new users on it If you find that when you rev the car, it's not that smooth in the transition to going up to basically the kick of the RPM, what you can then do is the transient fueling. So a nice little tip for doing this, if you open up the program SMON, and then once it connects, now I've got some gauges here. You can just go gauge add and type in these values to open them. I've got some gauges here, which is fuel add, transient fueling, RPM and TPS. So when I stamp on it, you can see that there's a nice transition on the RPM where the fuel is added. So if we look at that again, press the space bar to pause it. You can see the RPM comes up nicely, there's no stutter. If I then go to the corrections, transient fueling, let's say just take all the fueling out on the clamp. So your new value, put it to 0. Then do the same thing. See the RPM drops here, okay? This is where there's no transient fueling being applied here. So obviously at this point where the transient change of an airflow, you need to match it with the fuel. And you can see here the RPM has dipped for a split second after doing that because the mixture was not right, okay? So a key thing to do in that, basically just increase the fueling until you find the transient is smooth based on your given temperature and RPM, based on the clamp. The gain values and the decay you shouldn't really need to change. It's just going to be the positive clamp values because depending on the size of the injectors you have, obviously the clamp value can change. Okay. So ignition table, again, up to a user to go about that. Launch control.